The day was like any other for Jake Mitchell, a man who lived a quiet life in a small, peaceful town on Earth. He had grown accustomed to the calmness of his routine: work, home, sleep, and repeat. Jake had no family to speak of, no friends to visit, and no one to share his life with. But he was fine with it. He liked it that way. The solitude allowed him to focus on his work and hobbies, and it gave him the space he needed to think and be alone. That all changed on a crisp autumn evening when Jake heard a knock at his door. At first he thought it might be a neighbor asking to borrow something or maybe a delivery, but when he opened the door, he was met with something entirely unexpected. A woman stood there, but not just any woman. She was unlike anyone Jake had ever seen before. Her skin was a soft shade of pale blue, almost like the color of a clear sky at dusk. Her eyes, large and dark, stared at him with an intensity that made him uneasy. She was tall, with an ethereal, graceful presence, as though she didn't quite belong in this world. Her clothes were strange. Light, flowing fabric, that seemed to shimmer under the streetlights. "I'm sorry to bother you, human," she said, her voice soft yet filled with urgency, "but I need your help." Jake blinked, still stunned by the sight before him. He opened his mouth to speak but didn't know what to say. This wasn't something that happened every day. He had heard about alien species and intergalactic conflicts, but he never imagined one would show up at his doorstep. She took a step closer, her gaze never leaving his. "My name is Lyra," she continued. "I am an alien widow, and I have nowhere else to go. My children, they need your help. Please." The mention of her children made Jake snap out of his daze. "Children?" he repeated, looking down at the two small figures standing behind her. They were small, fragile-looking beings, with soft, blue skin and large eyes similar to their mother's, but with a certain innocence that made them look even more vulnerable. One of them, a girl, clung to her mother's side, while the other, a boy, hid behind her leg, peeking out at Jake. Jake looked back at Lyra, confused and unsure of what to do. "I don't know what you want from me," he said, his voice hesitant. "I'm just a regular guy." Lyra sighed, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I know this is difficult to understand, but my people have been wiped out. My home, my family, all gone. My children are all that's left of my kind. We are being hunted and I have nowhere to go. I need your protection." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had heard stories about wars and the destruction of entire civilizations, but he never imagined he'd be faced with a real-life tragedy like this. "You're asking me for protection?" he asked, his voice still shaky. "Why me?" "Because you're the only one who can help," Lyra said. "I know it's a lot to ask, but my children are in danger, the ones who destroyed my people. They will come for us, and we need somewhere safe to hide." Jake stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. He had always considered himself an average person, someone who followed the rules and kept to himself. But here was a woman, an alien widow, standing at his door asking for his help. And not just her help. She was asking for him to protect her children, to keep them safe from whatever danger was chasing them. After a long pause, Jake finally spoke. "What do you need me to do?" Lyra stepped closer, her voice gentle yet firm. "I need you to let us stay here just for a while. I promise we won't be any trouble. I just need to make sure my children are safe." Jake glanced at the two kids again. The boy, still hiding behind his mother's leg, had a look of fear in his eyes, while the girl stared at him curiously, as though she was trying to figure him out. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. Letting them stay meant inviting the unknown into his life. He could be putting himself in danger, his peaceful life shattered by this stranger from another world. But the look in Lyra's eyes, the desperation in her voice made it clear that she had no other choice. "I don't know what to say," Jake muttered, running a hand through his hair. "But I can't just turn you away." Lyra's eyes softened and a small, grateful smile appeared on her face. "Thank you, human. You are our only hope." Jake stepped aside, allowing her and her children to enter. As they walked into his home, He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. Jake stood in the doorway, watching Lyra and her children enter his home. The quiet, familiar space he had always known now felt like a strange new world. The alien widow and her 2 children, small and fragile, clinging to their mother's side, moved silently through the entryway. Jake's eyes followed them, his thoughts racing as he tried to comprehend what was happening. Lyra glanced back at him, her eyes full of gratitude, but also something darker, fear. She gently led her children to the living room, where they sat, down on the couch. The children, though obviously frightened, were strangely calm. The boy clutched a small stuffed animal in his hands, and the girl, who was slightly older, kept looking around the room with wide eyes, taking in every detail. Jake closed the door behind them, feeling the weight of his decision settle over him. "You're safe here," he said, though his words felt hollow. He wasn't sure if he was saying it to reassure them or to reassure himself. Lyra nodded but didn't speak for a moment. She glanced down at her children, then back at Jake. "I'm sorry for coming to you like this," she said softly. "I know it's unexpected and you don't owe me anything, but my children, my people, are all I have left. If I lose them, I will have nothing." Her voice trembled, and for a brief moment, Jake saw the weight of her loss, the deep sorrow that she carried with her. Jake felt a pang of sympathy but didn't know what to say. He didn't understand what it was like to lose an entire family or to be forced into hiding, far from everything familiar. The alien woman standing before him had already been through more than he could imagine. She wasn't asking for much. Just safety, a place to hide, a chance to keep her children alive. "Where are you from?" Jake finally asked, sitting down at the opposite end of the couch from Lyra. Lyra's expression shifted slightly, her sadness deepening. "My home planet, it's gone. My people were peaceful, kind. We lived among the stars in harmony with other species. But a war broke out. The ones who attacked us, raiders, mercenaries, they destroyed everything. My family, they were killed. I managed to escape with my children, but I don't know how much longer we can hide." Jake could feel the pain in her words. She spoke about her people with such affection, as though she had lost something irreplaceable. He couldn't imagine what it would be like to lose an entire civilization. Her children, sitting quietly beside her, were the last of her kind. The responsibility of keeping them safe was now on his shoulders, a burden he had never expected to bear. He rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of it all. "Why didn't you go to the government? Surely someone else could help you," Jake asked, his voice filled with confusion. Lyra shook her head slowly. "We're not just refugees. We are a symbol of something that was destroyed. Many governments see us as a threat, as an obstacle. Some of them believe that keeping us alive is a mistake. Others want to use us for their own gain. We don't have anywhere else to go." Jake sat back, absorbing her words. It seemed impossible that something so terrible could happen to an entire people, leaving them so vulnerable. But Lyra wasn't the only one at risk. Her children were at the heart of the danger. They weren't just survivors. They were the last hope of her species. And the thought that others would want to exploit them or wipe them out made Jake's blood boil. "What do you need from me exactly?" he asked, his voice steady, but still unsure. "I mean, I'm just one person. I don't have the resources to fight a war or protect you like some kind of soldier." Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with both hope and sorrow. "You don't have to be a soldier, Jake. You just have to protect them, keep them safe. For now, that's all I need." Jake nodded slowly, though doubts lingered in his mind. He wasn't a hero, not in the traditional sense. He wasn't trained for combat or even for protecting others. He was just a man, living his life in a quiet town. But looking at Lyra, seeing the fear in her eyes and hearing the desperation in her voice, he realized that there was no turning back. He had already made the decision when he opened the door. Now he had to follow through. The silence between them hung heavy as Jake's thoughts raced. What would he do if someone came for them? If the mercenaries or whoever was chasing Lyra found out where they were hiding. Could he really protect them? Was he even capable of doing what needed to be done? Lyra seemed to sense his hesitation. She reached out, gently placing her hand on his. "I know this is a lot to ask," she said quietly, "but you're the only one who can help us. My children are so young, and they're not like you. They're fragile. Without someone to care for them, they won't survive." Her words struck a chord deep within Jake. He couldn't imagine what it would be like to lose a child, or to know that they were so vulnerable, so in need of protection. He had no choice but to help. "I'll do what I can," Jake finally said, his voice firm. "I'll protect them, I promise." Lyra's face softened, and she smiled faintly, relief washing over her. "Thank you, Jake. You don't know what this means to us." Jake didn't know what it meant, not yet, but he would find out soon enough. As he watched Lyra settle beside her children, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The future felt uncertain, full of danger and unknowns. But for now, he had made a choice, and he would stand by it no matter what came next. The days that followed felt like a blur to Jake. He was still trying to adjust to the fact that an alien widow and her 2 children were now living in his home. Every corner of his house, every quiet moment was filled with their presence. He was no longer alone. At first, things were awkward. Lyra, though grateful, kept to herself, often sitting silently with her children. They were always close to her, watching her every move. It seemed like they were all still processing the loss of their world, unable to fully embrace the new reality. Jake, too, didn't know what to say or do. He had always lived on his own, his days filled with the hum of routine, but now his world had been turned upside down. The quiet, peaceful life he had always known now felt distant. Lyra's children, though small and fragile, were always near, their eyes full of curiosity, but also fear. They didn't speak much, but they watched him closely. The boy, who couldn't have been older than 5, would occasionally peek at Jake with wide, innocent eyes. He was small, almost too small for his age, and he often clung to his mother's side. The girl, who appeared to be about 8, seemed more cautious. She would often stare at Jake but never approached him. Instead, she would hide behind her mother or sit quietly clutching her stuffed animal. It was clear to Jake that these children had been through more than anyone their age should ever experience. Their world had been shattered, and now they were forced to rely on a stranger for survival. It wasn't easy for either side. Jake didn't know how to talk to them. He didn't know how to comfort them. But he knew one thing: they were his responsibility now. Lyra, on the other hand, was an enigma. She was kind but distant, always keeping a watchful eye on her children. There were times when Jake would catch her looking at the family photos on his walls or standing by the window, her gaze lost in thought. She would never speak of her past, but Jake could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of what she had lost. As the days went on, Jake found himself doing things he never imagined. He cooked meals for them, made sure they had enough to eat, and did his best to make them feel at home. It wasn't much, but it was all he could offer. He'd never been good at cooking, but for them, he tried his best. Lyra would help when she could. She would quietly set the table, or sometimes she would take over the cooking, making strange but delicious meals that Jake had never tasted before. It was clear that, despite her grief, she still had a sense of responsibility for her children. She was a mother, and that was all she could focus on right now, keeping her children safe. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, Jake watched as Lyra served her children their food. The boy ate slowly, his small hands trembling slightly as he held the spoon. The girl, who hadn't spoken much, looked at Jake for the first time and nodded her head politely before beginning her meal. The silence at the table was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of people trying to find their place in a new world. Jake sat back in his chair, watching them with a strange sense of wonder. He had never expected his life to turn out like this, but here they were, 2 alien children and their mother, sitting in his living room sharing a meal together. It felt surreal, as if the whole world had shifted and left him standing in the middle of something much bigger than he was prepared for. After dinner, Lyra cleaned the dishes, while Jake played with the children. He tried to make them laugh, playing simple games and telling stories about life on Earth. He was careful not to push them too much, respecting their quiet nature. The girl, though still reserved, seemed to warm up to him slowly. She started to ask him questions about Earth, her curiosity growing. "What is the sky like here?" she asked, her voice small but inquisitive. Jake smiled, glad to see her engaging. "It's blue most of the time, but sometimes at sunset it turns orange and red like fire. You won't see a sky like that anywhere else." Her eyes widened, and for the first time since she had arrived, Jake saw a spark of interest in her eyes. It was small, but it was enough to make him feel like he was getting through to her. Meanwhile, Lyra watched from the kitchen, a faint smile on her face as she listened. She seemed relieved to see her children slowly adjusting to their new life. It wasn't much, but it was progress. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Lyra joined Jake on the couch. She sat a little farther away than she used to, still, unsure of how to bridge the emotional distance between them. She had shared her burden, her pain, but that didn't make it easier to connect with him. She was grateful, yes, but there was still a part of her that remained closed off. Jake didn't push her. He just sat in silence, the weight of their shared situation hanging between them. For the first time, he realized that this wasn't just about keeping her children safe. It was about offering something more: compassion, understanding, and connection. Something he had never really given much thought to before. Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "I know you're doing your best," she said softly, "but I don't want to burden you more than I already have." Jake shook his head. "You're not a burden, Lyra. I'm helping because I want to. You and your children are safe here." She nodded, her lips trembling slightly as she whispered, "Thank you, Jake. You don't know what this means to us." Jake gave her a reassuring smile, though he wasn't sure of the words to say next. This was all new to him, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. And maybe, just maybe, that was all that mattered. The days passed slowly and life seemed to settle into a new rhythm. Jake had adjusted to having Lyra and her children in his home, though it wasn't always easy. They were still strangers in many ways, and their differences made communication harder at times. But despite the tension and the unknown, something was growing, something beyond the awkwardness of their new living arrangement. There was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken bond built on survival and trust. But even as Jake went about his daily life, a dark cloud loomed over them. The threat that Lyra had warned him about, the mercenaries, the ones who had destroyed her home planet, wasn't gone. Jake could feel it even if he didn't want to admit it. One night, as Jake sat in his living room watching TV, Lyra walked in, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. The children were in bed, but the silence in the house felt heavier than usual. "Jake," Lyra began, her voice shaking slightly. "I've sensed something. They're here. They've found us." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He stood up quickly, instinctively moving closer to her. "What do you mean, they're here?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. Lyra's eyes were wide with panic. "I don't know how, but I feel it. The people who attacked my planet, they've followed us. They won't stop until they have my children." Jake's mind raced. He had been trying to convince himself that they were safe here, far away from the chaos that had followed Lyra from her home. But now, hearing the fear in her voice, he knew that it was no longer a question of safety. It was a question of survival. "What can we do?" Jake asked, his voice steady, though inside, he was anything but calm. He wasn't a fighter, but the thought of these mercenaries coming for Lyra's children filled him with dread. "We need to hide," Lyra said, her hands trembling. "But it may be too late for that. They're already here. They will come for us." Jake could see the fear in her eyes, and it made his stomach tighten. Lyra wasn't just worried for herself. She was terrified for her children. They were everything she had left, and he could see the deep love she had for them, the desperation to protect them. "We'll fight," Jake said, surprising even himself with his own words. "I won't let them hurt you. I won't let them hurt your kids." Lyra shook her head, a sad smile crossing her face. "You don't understand, Jake. They're not like you. They're ruthless. They'll do whatever it takes to get what they want." Jake's thoughts raced. He didn't know how to fight an enemy like that. He didn't have weapons, training, or any idea how to defend against mercenaries from another world. But there was one thing he did know. He wasn't going to let them hurt Lyra and her children. He had already made that promise. "We'll figure it out," Jake said, his voice firmer now. "I'll protect them. You don't have to worry." Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with both gratitude and disbelief. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask you to risk your life for us." Jake reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You didn't have to ask. I've already made my choice." For a moment there was silence between them, the weight of their situation pressing down on them both. Lyra's children, asleep in their rooms, had no idea of the danger looming over them. They were innocent, caught up in a war they had no part in. And Jake, the man who had opened his door to them, now found himself in a battle he never expected to fight. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of the mercenaries and how he would protect the people he had promised to keep safe. What if they came tomorrow? What if they already knew where they were? The sound of footsteps outside his door broke his thoughts. He got up quickly, moving quietly to the window. His eyes scanned the darkened street outside. There was nothing unusual, just the usual quiet of the night. But then, as if to confirm his fears, he saw it. Movement. Figures moving silently across the yard. They were too far away to be sure, but Jake's gut told him that they were the ones Lyra had warned him about. His heart raced. Without thinking, he grabbed his phone and texted Lyra, "They're here." A moment later, Lyra's reply came through, "Stay quiet. Don't make a sound." Jake's breath quickened. He quickly turned off all the lights and moved toward the children's room. They had to stay hidden. He couldn't afford to let them see how dangerous things had become. When he reached the room, he knelt beside the bed where the children were sleeping, their small bodies tucked beneath the covers. He gently shook the girl awake, his finger pressed to his lips. "Shh," he whispered. "We need to be quiet, okay?" The girl nodded, her eyes wide with fear as she looked up at him. The boy stirred next, sensing the tension in the room. Jake motioned for them to follow him, and together they moved silently down the hall. Lyra had already moved to the front door, her face grim, her eyes alert. She looked at Jake, and for the first time he saw something in her eyes. Desperation, yes, but also a resolve. She wasn't going to let her children be taken without a fight. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice steady. "We need to move now." Jake nodded. "What do we do?" Lyra didn't answer immediately. She just looked at the door, as if listening. And then, with a final, determined glance at Jake, she said, "We run." The night had fallen heavy with tension, and Jake knew they had to move quickly. The sound of footsteps outside his house, the unmistakable feeling of being hunted, had set his heart racing. Lyra's words echoed in his mind. "We run." He wasn't sure what exactly he was running from, but the fear in her eyes told him that there was no time to waste. Lyra, who had always been the calm and collected one, seemed even more focused now. Her gaze never wavered from the door. She moved with purpose, organizing the children and quietly ushering them out of the room. The children, who had been afraid to sleep soundly since they arrived, seemed to sense that something was different this time. The girl, still wide-eyed, took her brother's hand and nodded at Jake. "Stay close," Jake whispered as he ushered them through the hallway. His voice was steady, though he was anything but calm inside. He glanced at Lyra, who was already ahead of him, her body tense but ready. She had been through far worse than this, he thought. She had witnessed the fall of her entire civilization, and had survived. But what about her children? They were so young and so innocent. The responsibility of their safety weighed heavily on Jake's shoulders. They moved silently through the house, careful not to make a sound. The children seemed to understand the gravity of the situation and followed Jake's lead, their small feet barely making a noise on the hardwood floor. They reached the back door and Jake paused. Lyra turned to him. "You should go first," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll cover you." Jake shook his head. "No, we stick together. We leave as a family." For a moment, Lyra hesitated. Then her expression softened and she nodded. She stepped beside him and together they moved out into the dark, the cool night air a stark contrast to the heat of fear that ran through Jake's veins. Outside, the world was still, eerily quiet except for the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. Jake kept his hand on the children's shoulders, guiding them through the darkness. Every step felt like an eternity. He glanced back at the house, his mind racing. The mercenaries were close, he could feel it. Lyra led the way, her eyes scanning the horizon. "We need to get to the woods," she said quietly, her voice full of urgency. "We can lose them there." Jake nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He was trying to think of a plan. He didn't have weapons, training, or anything that could help them in a fight. But he had something else. Something he hadn't thought about until now. He had courage. He had determination. And for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he was capable of. The group continued through the yard, their footsteps muffled by the grass. The sound of branches cracking in the distance made Jake freeze, his heart pounding. Lyra, sensing the tension, motioned for them to crouch low to the ground. They all ducked into the shadows of a large tree, hoping that the cover of night would keep them hidden. Jake held his breath, straining his ears. The distant sounds of footsteps grew louder, closer. They were coming. His mind raced with panic. He didn't have a plan. What if they were found? What would he do? But then, something unexpected happened. Lyra placed a hand on his arm, her touch, gentle yet firm. "You're not alone in this, Jake," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "I promised myself that I would protect my children, but you've given us something I never thought we would have again. Hope. You're stronger than you think." Her words struck a chord deep within him. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that, how much it meant to him to hear her say that. The weight of responsibility that had been pressing down on him seemed to lighten, just a little. "You don't have to do this alone," Lyra added. "We're in this together. We'll make it through as long as we stick together." Jake looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. The strength in her eyes, the resilience that shone through even in her darkest moments. It was something he could see in himself now. He wasn't just a man trying to protect strangers. He was part of something bigger, a protector of something precious. The quiet assurance in her voice made him believe, even if just for a moment, that they could make it through. Together they could fight whatever came their way. The children, sensing the shift in the air, huddled closer to Lyra. The boy was still clinging to his mother, but the girl, the older one, looked up at Jake with wide eyes, full of trust. "We'll be okay," Jake whispered, though he wasn't entirely sure. But he knew he couldn't show fear now, not to Lyra, not to her children. As they waited, the sounds of footsteps grew closer. The mercenaries were closing in. They were running out of time. Lyra gave a small nod, signaling it was time to move. Jake led the way, his heart racing, but his mind clearer than before. They were a family now, united by a shared purpose. And with that purpose came the strength to keep moving forward, even in the face of impossible odds. As they made their way toward the woods, the sound of distant voices echoed in the still night. Jake didn't look back. They had no time for fear, only time to survive. And together, they would. The night was still, the cool air carrying the scent of pine as Jake and Lyra hurried through the woods. The crunch of leaves beneath their feet was the only sound that broke the silence. The children, once again close by their mother's side, moved as quietly as possible, their small feet making almost no sound. But the fear that gripped them all was undeniable. Jake's heart raced, not just from the fear of being caught, but from the knowledge that they were being hunted. Mercenaries, sent to find them. The thought made his stomach churn. They had no time. He had to protect them no matter what. Lyra led the way, her keen senses guiding them through the trees. She moved with grace and purpose, the quiet of the night cloaking them in shadows. But even the darkness couldn't hide the danger that was closing in. "We need to reach the old cabin," Lyra whispered, her voice steady despite the urgency in her words. "It's hidden. It will be our best chance to stay safe." Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the forest around them. His mind raced with thoughts of what could happen if they were found. The mercenaries weren't just soldiers. They were hunters. They didn't stop until they had their target. And Lyra's children were the most valuable thing they would ever come across. The thought of what they might do to them made Jake's blood boil. "Is there a way to fight back?" Jake asked quietly as they walked, keeping his voice low so the children wouldn't hear. "Do you have any weapons, anything to defend ourselves?" Lyra shook her head. "I don't have any weapons. Our people, we don't fight like that. But there is something I can do, something that can help us." Jake looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "There's a way to hide our presence," Lyra explained, her voice soft but determined. "We can make ourselves invisible, to them at least for a while. But it won't last long. It's not a perfect solution." Jake's mind raced as he processed her words. He had heard of cloaking technology, but he never imagined that an alien species could do something like this naturally. Still, it was a temporary solution. It wasn't going to keep them hidden forever. "Then we'll make it count," Jake said, his voice firm. "We'll get to that cabin and wait for the right moment." The woods grew denser as they moved forward, the trees closing in around them. The air felt colder, and the weight of the night pressed down on Jake's shoulders. He could feel the tension in Lyra's movements, the fear in her every step. She was holding it together for her children, but Jake could see that it was taking everything she had. He had never seen her so vulnerable. "We're almost there," Lyra whispered, looking back at him. Jake nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. His eyes darted between the trees, searching for any movement, any sign that the mercenaries were close. He had never been in a situation like this before. He was used to solving problems with his hands, fixing things. But this was different. He wasn't sure what to do next, but he knew that he couldn't afford to let Lyra or her children down. Suddenly, the sound of a branch snapping broke the silence. Jake froze, his heart leaping into his throat. The noise was loud enough to echo through the trees, and for a moment everything seemed to stop. Lyra's eyes widened in alarm. "They're close," she whispered urgently. "Hurry." Jake grabbed the children's hands, urging them forward. His breath came in quick, shallow bursts as they picked up the pace, moving faster through the dense forest. The cabin wasn't far now. He could see the faint outline of it through the trees. His hope surged, but then the unmistakable sound of footsteps reached his ears. The mercenaries were closing in, their heavy boots crunching through the leaves. Jake's pulse quickened. They had to make it to the cabin. There was no other choice. His eyes flicked to Lyra, and for the first time, he saw the uncertainty in her expression. She was the one who had always been in control, the one who had led them this far, but even she knew they were out of time. "There's no way we're getting out of this without a fight," Jake said, his voice low but determined. Lyra didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. Her eyes told him everything. They were both thinking the same thing. There was no escaping. The only option left was to fight, to make a stand. They reached the cabin, and Lyra quickly moved to the door. With one last glance behind her, she gestured for Jake and the children to follow. Her inside. The door creaked as it opened, and they rushed in, slamming it behind them. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold, but it offered shelter. Jake quickly moved to the window, peering outside. His heart sank as he saw figures moving toward the cabin, their shapes barely visible in the dim light. The mercenaries were almost there. "We don't have long," Jake said, turning to Lyra. "What now?" Lyra didn't hesitate. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes. focusing on something Jake couldn't see. Her body shimmered, and for a brief moment, the air around her seemed to ripple. Jake watched in awe as she became almost invisible, her outline blurring into the shadows. It was an eerie sight, but it gave him hope. "I'll hold them off for as long as I can," Lyra said, her voice barely audible. "You keep the children safe. Don't let them see what happens." Jake nodded, though his heart was heavy with the thought of what was to come. The mercenaries were getting closer, and they would stop at nothing to get to Lyra's children. But he wasn't going to let them take them without a fight. With Lyra's help, they had one chance. It was time to make it count. The night was thick with tension as Jake and Lyra crouched in the darkness of the cabin, listening for any sound outside. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of earth and leaves, but underneath that, there was something else. A faint crunch of footsteps, the soft sound of men moving closer. They were here. The mercenaries had found them. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he turned to Lyra, her figure barely visible in the shadows. She had cloaked herself again, her alien abilities rendering her almost invisible. He could see her outline, a faint shimmer in the dark, but nothing more. She was calm, focused, but he could feel the fear in the air, thick and heavy. This was it. They had no more time to hide. Lyra's voice, barely a whisper, broke the silence. "They'll be coming in any minute. We have to hold our ground." Jake nodded, his hands clenched into fists. He wasn't a soldier, wasn't trained to fight, but right now, there was only one thing that mattered: protecting these children. He had promised to keep them safe, and no matter what, he was going to keep that promise. "We don't have much time," Jake said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "What do we do now?" Lyra's voice was calm, but there was a tension behind her words. "I'll deal with them. I'll take care of the mercenaries. You make sure the children stay hidden. Do not let them see any of this." Jake's heart sank at the thought of what Lyra might have to do. He didn't want her to fight alone, didn't want her to be forced to face this danger on her own. But he knew that in this situation, there was no other choice. She was their only hope. "I won't let them get past me," Lyra said, her words firm, her resolve clear. "I'll protect them too." Jake swallowed hard, his thoughts racing. What if they couldn't stop them? What if Lyra's powers weren't enough? What if he wasn't enough? But he didn't have time for doubts. They were here, and they had to act. The children were counting on them. Lyra stepped forward, her movements fluid, like a shadow slipping through the night. She made her way to the door, her eyes scanning the outside, waiting for the right moment. Jake held his breath, his gaze fixed on the children, who were huddled together in the corner. The boy clutched his stuffed animal tightly, his eyes wide, with fear, while the girl kept glancing nervously at Jake as if searching for reassurance. "Stay quiet," Jake whispered, kneeling beside them. "I'll be right here. No matter what happens, I won't let anything happen to you." The girl nodded, her small hand gripping her brother's. Jake reached out to touch her shoulder, giving her a small, reassuring smile. His heart ached for them. They didn't deserve any of this. No child should ever have to hide, to fear for their life. But it was the reality they were living in now. Outside, the footsteps grew louder, the crunching leaves growing closer. Jake's pulse quickened, his instincts screaming that they needed to act. He glanced at Lyra one more time. She had positioned herself near the back window, her eyes fixed on the approaching mercenaries, her body tense. Without warning, the door to the cabin was slammed open. Jake's heart leaped in his chest as a group of shadowy figures stepped into the room. The mercenaries, armed and dangerous, scanned the room with cold, calculating eyes. They had found them. "Lyra!" One of the mercenaries called out, his voice gruff and cruel. "You can't hide forever. Come out and surrender. We won't harm the children. If you cooperate." Jake's breath caught in his throat. He had no idea how Lyra would handle this, how she would respond to the threat they posed. But then the figure at the front of the room, Lyra, stepped forward, her form shimmering and fading into visibility. Her eyes locked onto the mercenaries, and in that moment Jake could see everything in her. Her strength, her determination, and the fierce love she had for her children. "No," she said softly, but her voice was filled with authority. "You will not touch them." The mercenaries froze. They weren't expecting this. They had underestimated her. Jake could see it in their eyes. The leader of the group sneered, taking a step forward. "You think you can stop us? You're just one alien. You're outmatched." Lyra's eyes glowed faintly as she moved with lightning speed. She was a blur of motion, faster than Jake could follow. In an instant she had taken down 2 of the mercenaries, her strength and precision unmatched. The remaining men drew their weapons, but they were too slow. Lyra was already on them, moving like a force of nature as if nothing could stand in her way. Jake stood frozen, watching in awe as Lyra fought, her movements fluid and powerful. He had never seen anything like it. She was no longer just the alien widow who had knocked on his door. She was a warrior, a protector, and she was willing to sacrifice everything to keep her children safe. As the last of the mercenaries fell to the floor, Lyra stood over them, her chest heaving with exertion, her face hard with determination. She looked at Jake, her eyes softening. For a moment, "It's over," she said quietly, her voice full of relief. "They won't be coming back." Jake couldn't speak. He was still in shock, still processing what had just happened. But as he looked at Lyra, standing tall, the fierce protector of her children, something inside him clicked. He realized in that moment how far they had come, from strangers to family. Lyra turned to the children, her expression softening as she knelt down to their level. "It's safe now," she whispered. "You're safe." The children, still, wide-eyed, rushed to their mother, clinging to her as if they had just been given back a part of their world they had lost. Jake watched them, a feeling of warmth growing inside him. This was what he had fought for. This was why he had made the decision to help them, to protect them, because they were worth it. In the silence that followed, Jake finally found his voice. "You did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Lyra nodded, her gaze meeting his. "We did it," she corrected softly. Jake smiled. "Yes, we did."